So I've been very interested in the Nietzschean idea of the death of God, right? Nietzsche believed, like Dostoevsky, that once our faith in a transcendent being collapsed, that the political, in some sense, would immediately become religious, or that nihilism would prevail. Those were the basic two outcomes. And both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky took that farther. They also prophesied that not only would the political become sacred, as it took the place of what was sacred, but that there would be a particular kind of political endeavor that would become sacred, and that would be the endeavor that eventually manifested itself as in the communist ethos. And that all came true with a vengeance. But I was wondering more recently, the Judeo-Christian claim, and this is the monotheistic claim, is that there's a transcendent spirit to which we must pledge allegiance, so we must worship and celebrate, let's say, that we must mimic. And that constitutes the basis of the religious enterprise. But then there's an analogous claim, which I think is derived from that claim, that there's a transcendent object whose fundamental nature escapes our apprehension, and that pursuit of a relationship with that transcendent object is the proper activity of the scientist. And so that would be the scientist who always assumes that his epistemology, that his theories are incomplete, that something real and comprehensible lies outside the domain of that theory, and that attempting to make contact with that transcendent domain is actually the proper mode of conduct for a scientist. And I can't help but see that as both deeply analogous to, and maybe even a derivation of, that more fundamental religious orientation. And so then I've been wondering more recently, is that if the death of God, so to speak, also, although surprisingly, will mean the demise of the Enlightenment enterprise, because it was predicated on an unconscious religiosity that presumed the existence of a transcendent object and the possibility of a beneficial relationship between the inquirer, the scientist, and that object itself. Let me differentiate two subcategories in relationship to that. I've talked a lot to people like Sam Harris and to Richard Dawkins about exactly these issues, say about the antagonism between religion and science. And so one of the things that I really saw, so Dawkins regards the religious enterprise as pseudoscientific, all that body of pseudoscientific proclamation that impedes the rational progress of Enlightenment science. And so that's his perspective, and I'm not trying to parody it or to put it down in any sense. I'm just trying to relate it. And whereas Harris, and I'm using these two people because they're examples perhaps of the world's most famous atheists. Harris's argument is more, it's more emotional than that in some sense. And I don't mean irrational, I mean based in a deeper emotion. Harris identifies the spirit of totalitarianism and malevolence with the religious enterprise. And I think that's an error because he's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. You're talking about the antagonism between religion and science, so one of the things I really admired about Dawkins, and his work has been quite helpful to me, by the way, is that he has this clear-headed faith in science, in rationality that's typical of the best scientists, perhaps someone like Feynman, for example. But Dawkins, like all true scientists, believes that there is a transcendent truth and that the pursuit of that truth will set us free. And it's those claims that I think are essentially religious. And so I think it's useful to differentiate between the religious impulse towards truth, if you can call that the religious impulse, and the totalitarian aspect of the imposition of religious dogma, which I see actually as a variant not of the religious spirit, but of the totalitarian spirit. Because I do believe the greatest scientists that I've known have a religious reverence for truth. Now they say objective truth, and that's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable variant of truth. But the reverence itself doesn't seem to me to be scientific. It's predicated on whatever it is that drives reverence. And I'm afraid that what's happening at the level of the postmodern critique is that it's actually a corrosive critique of that reverence itself. It's the claim that that reverence is nothing but a mask for power claims, for example. And that is a corrosive criticism. And it might be corrosive enough to bring the whole damn enterprise to a halt. And I see it shuddering forward with the corruption of journals like Nature and Science and the increasing politicization of every scientific discussion. Yeah. The belief in the existence of a transcendent object. And I would say that's a faith-based belief, and here's why. So you have a scientific theory, and you can't help but look at the world of objects through that theory. So when you see the world of objects in your discipline, that vision, that perception is informed by your epistemology. But you know as a scientist that you're wrong. But the knowledge that you're wrong is predicated on an assumption, and the assumption is that there is a domain of information that exists as yet outside your presuppositions. And that has to be a faith-based axiom, because given that source of information exists beyond your current set of axioms, you can't encounter it. You have to just accept it as a continuing reality. And it would be the reality of that knowledge that currently lies beyond us. I think this is extremely interesting. You referred to that as a love. And that's not an objective observation in some sense, right? It's a reference to a particular kind of motivation. Yeah. And so, but then let's say we can inquire into that a little bit more deeply. We might say, well, what's that love predicated on? And one possible source is that, well, you see that it engages you in a meaningful enterprise, right? So there's a sense of implicit meaning in this search to make contact with that which still lies beyond you. And so that's engaging, and it's deeply engaging. It's part of the instinct of meaning as far as I'm concerned. But it's also predicated on the idea, and I can't help but think that this is fundamentally a religious axiom. And I think it's a Judeo-Christian derived religious axiom, which is that you also believe that the truth will set you free. I don't see that as anything different than a reference to the idea, for example, that the divine word that the word of truth itself is divine, and that the manifestation of that truth is in fact freeing. And I don't think that's a within science claim. Now, your proposition, and I think this is the proposition of true scientists, is no, you have to abandon your political presumptions completely. And that means that you have to face even those truths that make you tremendously uncomfortable cognitively and emotionally in the moment. You cannot use that discomfort as evidence. You have to assume, regardless of such evidence, strangely enough, that in the final analysis, all things considered, there's nothing that's more liberating than the truth. And Matt, I think that's the core doctrine. I do believe that's the core doctrine upon which Judeo-Christian society itself is founded, because the doctrine of the divine word is something like this, as far as I've been able to tell. It's something like the proper action of the consciousness that liberates us is the forthright confrontation with possibility itself, with potential itself, and the willingness to confront that head on in truth. And the consequence of that confrontation is the construction of the habitable world that is good. That seems to me to be the doctrine of the word at the beginning of Genesis. And there's a notion there that human beings, men and women alike, are made in that image. The negative religious phenomena that you're describing are a manifestation not of the religious spirit, but of the totalitarian spirit, and that those are often conflated. Okay, and then I would say that, and to put this into a deeper context, that sense of wonder that you described, I don't think that there is any difference between that and proper worship. because I think attending to the wonder of being is the fundamental religious act in some real sense. And there are preconditions for that, and one of them is an epistemic humility, right? You have to allow yourself to apprehend that which is beyond. And that is an instinct, and I think it's part of the instinct that drives love itself. And so I'd be very interested, for example, in the psychophysiology of awe, and that's associated with wonder. And so one of the things that's extraordinarily interesting about awe is that it involves piloerection. And so, when you see a cat puff itself up in a burst of fur, when it sees a giant predator, it's piloerection that's driving that. And when you get those chills up and down your back and maybe your hair stands on end, it's that same apprehension of you can think about a predator as an unsolved mystery to an animal. We use that same framework of wonder and awe to apprehend the unknown itself. And we've learned to contend with the unknown as a potential predator, obviously, but also as a potential source of redemption. And that, I would say, being guided by that sense of wonder, which is humility predicated and driven by a desire to pursue the truth, that is the manifestation of the most fundamental religious instinct. And I think that needs to be differentiated from religion as a dogmatic structure, which can degenerate towards totalitarianism like any other human endeavor, and does, right? And we have to be on the watch for that. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. When you're training a scientist, you're not stuffing someone's head full of scientific facts, not primarily, although you may also be doing that. What you're doing is training an adherence to a certain spirit of inquiry. And then I would say that the great achievement of the scientific enlightenment is not the production of that body of knowledge, even though that's admirable in and of itself. It's the training and fostering of a spirit of inquiry that's passed forward from let's say, PhD supervisor to student in the entire scientific enterprise. And that the most valid,
yeah.
Okay. So, and then I would say, it isn't obvious to me that those who pursue a genuine religious or alternative creative path are distinguishable in some sense in their ethical orientation from genuine scientists. It's the same spirit. It's a spirit of humility. It's a spirit of pursuit of truth. It's a desire for relationship with the transcendent. I know that's viewed differently by scientists because of their emphasis on the object, but it isn't obvious what the transcendent object is. I mean, it gets less obvious as we investigate it in some real sense. Yeah, well, I've met Dawkins a number of times, and as I said, his thinking has had quite a lot of influence on the way I think in many, many ways. And I can't help but admire him. And it's an interesting thing because I believe that his insistence that the religious enterprise is nothing but a superstitious impediment to the clear progress of science, I think that that's insufficiently differentiated because it doesn't differentiate spirit from totalitarianism. It conflates them. And the totalitarian spirit is subtle enough so that identifying it with a given domain of endeavor, let's say the religious, is a dangerous understatement of the true danger of that ethos, because it can permeate everything and is likely to. And so if we put the enemy in the wrong place, so if the scientific types, for example, assume that it's manifestation of the religious spirit that's the primary impediment to the scientific endeavor, then we're going to be fighting the wrong war. And we're going to make enemies out of people who should be allies. I do believe that the West at its best, and that would be the West insofar as the West has carried the beacon of freedom and human dignity. And of course, we faltered in that in many ways, that at its best, the West acts out that claim that the truth will set you free. And we've done that on the religious front when we've been properly religious, and we've done it on the scientific front when we've been properly scientific. And we lose that fundamental faith at our immense peril, unless we're willing to believe that human engineered deceit, which is not a bad definition of totalitarianism, is a desire, or nihilism itself, as belief in everything collapses. We don't want to. Do we want a world where we accept either of those alternatives, or their dreadful marriage, let's say, as the alternative? And this is a decision that we're all making, not least those of us who are scientists. And so the scientists who are listening, I would also say, you great scientists, or not so great even, you bend the truth to political purposes, not only at your own great peril as practicing scientists and as human beings, but you also warp the entire structure of the world. And that is an absolute abdication of the opportunities that have been granted to you by a society that strived for hundreds of years to give you the privilege of engaging in this pursuit of the truth.
Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please consider supporting this channel by subscribing. New videos are on the way.